Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine just for a second a world where, I don't know, the biggest financial crashes, the most important scientific discoveries,
Yeah.
even how empires rise and fall. What if none of that is random? What if it's all part of some huge plan, thousands of years old? And what if everything you think you know about money, about power, maybe even reality itself is just an illusion someone built?
It's a wild thought, isn't it? Really grabs you. And today, that's exactly where we're heading. We're doing a really deep dive into some fascinating material from this text. Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and .pdf.
Yeah, our mission today is to unpack the, well, frankly, astonishing and sometimes pretty unsettling connections this source makes. It links the esoteric world of alchemy
Right.
to the cold, hard facts of finance, advanced physics, ancient civilizations, and these, powerful secret societies that it claims have basically shaped human history.
Yeah.
Now, you've asked us to distill this kind of knowledge quickly but thoroughly. You're looking for those aha moments, multiple viewpoints, without getting totally bogged down. And this deep dive, I think it really promises to deliver that.
I think so, too. We're basically exploring a narrative that suggests there's this hidden logic, a consistent thread, behind things in history and science that seem totally unrelated.
Okay.
It talks about this deep, ongoing relationship between, the fundamental nature of physics and how global finance works. It's definitely going to challenge some standard ways of thinking. The source actually calls it a journey into the raw truth, some really provocative insights.
Okay, raw truth. Provocative is right. So let's unpack this. Where do we start? The source kicks off with something that sounds, well, almost like fantasy, argues it's real. The alchemical roots of money and power.
Yeah, it jumps right in.
It makes this really striking claim that modern fiat money, the dollar, the euro, and the whole system of reserve banking, it's basically a modern version of the philosopher's stone.
That's it. And that idea, it's incredibly provocative, like you said. I mean, traditionally, the philosopher's stone, that was the mythical thing, right? Turning lead into gold, maybe giving you immortality.
Oh, right, the alchemist's dream.
Yeah. But here, in this source's view, the modern equivalent isn't about changing actual metal. It's about creating credit, basically money, out of thin air.
Out of nothing.
Out of nothing. The source literally says, from the creation of credit out of nothing, gold is produced. This whole idea, creation ex nihilo, it's absolutely key to understanding the author's perspective here. They see the financial system as fundamentally manipulated, designed to pull wealth and power into fewer hands.
So it's like financial magic almost, creating value, or at least the appearance of value, where there wasn't any before.
Exactly. And they don't mince words about it either. They call this private creation of credit things like alchemical charlatanism.
Charlatanism.
Or even, get this, negative information. That suggests it's not just making money, it's like actively messing up the system itself, like a computer virus maybe, or throwing off some kind of energetic balance.
And they contrast this with what? What's the alternative they propose?
Well, they contrast it really sharply with a different model. Money that's just a receipt, basically, a debt-free receipt for actual goods and services produced by a nation for its people, issued by the state, crucially, without any interest-bearing debt attached.
So state money versus private debt-based money.
That's the core distinction they keep coming back to. It's fundamental to their whole argument.
Okay. Now, this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, pretty disturbing. The source draws this connection to Nazi Germany.
Yeah, this part is, it's quite something.
It claims that the Nazis, because they nationalized their banks and credit institutions, they actually understood this deep, almost mystical link between what the source calls alchemical physics and alchemical finance.
Right. And according to the source, this wasn't just some abstract idea for them. It supposedly let them develop. Well, the source claims an ultimate energy source, an ultimate power to transport mankind, and even an ultimate power for destruction on a doomsday scale.
Doomsday scale.
And the source is very clear. They were apparently willing to put it to supremely evil uses.
Okay, this really goes against the standard history we learned, doesn't it? And the source goes even further. It suggests the Holocaust, from the Nazis' own twisted viewpoint, had this grisly and gruesome logic tied to how they saw Jewish influence in finance. It claims that Jewish people enslaved in concentration camps were tragically forced to work on creating this new physics and economy. Now, let's be absolutely crystal clear here. We are reporting what the source claims about the Nazis' warped rationale. This is not us endorsing this repulsive idea. It's stating what the source alleges the Nazis believed and acted on.
Absolutely. It's crucial to make that distinction. The source itself points out that this was a half-truth even within the Nazi ideology, noting that powerful Protestant financial groups were also deeply involved.
Right.
So it's not endorsing the Nazi view at all, but reporting on their alleged twisted internal logic. The source actually says something like, "Their all truth stops and the lies begin," when talking about the Nazis blaming Jewish people entirely. But it does claim the Nazis operated with this grisly logic from their perspective based on that warped worldview.
Okay, so connecting this back, this chilling idea that the Nazis grasped some profound link between physics and finance and tried to weaponize it, it forces us to ask, well, who else? Who else in history might have understood this connection? And what did they do with it?
And that question leads us straight into the next part, what the source calls the Lee clan and the architect of Meltdown.
Right. And the focus here is on a specific person, Dr. David X. Lee. And this formula he created is called on-default correlation, a copula approach. He published it back in 2000 while he was working for the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, CIBC.
So why is this one formula so notorious, as the source calls it? I mean, it sounds like complex math, right?
Exactly.
Well, the source argues that its apparent simplicity was actually beguiling. It looked elegant, but that simplicity hid major problems and ultimately helped cause huge damage to the global economy.
How so? What did it actually do?
Okay, so a copula approach, basically it's a way to model how different risks might fail together. Think about lots of different mortgages. The formula tried to predict the chance that many of them would default around the same time.
Like dominoes falling?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
How tightly linked are those risks?
Yeah.
The problem, as one analyst quoted in the source points out, is getting the input data right. Just figuring out the chance of one mortgage defaulting is hard enough, right? You need lots of data, statistical analysis. But trying to figure out the conditional probability, like what's the chance loan B defaults if loan A already has, that's way harder. Why? Because you have much less historical data for those specific combined events. Scarcity of historical data, the source calls it.
Ah, so the model looked neat on paper, but it was built on shaky ground because there wasn't enough real-world data to feed it accurately, especially for those linked events.
Precisely. It created a false sense of certainty about risks that were actually very difficult to quantify properly. A simple model for a complex, data-poor reality. And the results were, well, catastrophic for the financial system.
Okay, that makes sense. But then the source digs deeper, right, into these hidden family connections around Dr. David Lee.
Yes, and this is where it gets really intriguing. It points out that while Dr. David Lee was at CIBC publishing this formula, another member of the Lee clan, a very famous Hong Kong billionaire named Li Ka-shing.
I've heard of him. Huge figure.
Right. Well, Li Ka-shing owned a major chunk of stock in that same bank, CIBC, at the very same time.
No kidding. So same clan, same bank, same time as this risky formula emerges.
Exactly. And the connections go further. Li Ka-shing's family took on important government roles when Hong Kong transitioned back to China. And there's another Li mentioned, Li Chang, who was apparently head of Red China's main foreign trade corporation back then.
Wow. Okay, so the clan is deeply embedded in finance and government, both in the West and in China.
Deeply. And check this timing. Dr. David Lee leaves CIBC in 2004. The very next year, 2005, Li Ka-shing sells his big stake in the bank.
Huh. That timing does seem convenient, or maybe prescient.
It definitely raises questions, doesn't it? But the really mind-blowing part is how far back the source traces this clan's influence. Not just decades, but millennia.
Millennia? Seriously?
Yeah. The source claims the clan had emperors, like one named Li Zhuangsu, supposedly ruling before 2000 BC, and a member of the Li clan founded the Tang dynasty in China.
The Tang dynasty, that was a massive deal culturally, economically.
Huge. Lasted from 618 to 906 AD. And here's the kicker for our topic. The source states it was the Li clan who introduced paper money to China during the Tang dynasty.
Wait, they introduced paper money?
According to the source, yes. So think about that. This isn't just some minor historical footnote. It suggests this one lineage has been fundamentally involved with the very mechanisms of money, banking, and government across huge spans of history.
Okay, let's piece this together. You've got this ancient, powerful Chinese clan involved in governance and finance way back. The same clan pops up millennia later, involved in major financial institutions, even introducing paper money.
Right.
And then A modern member of that same clan develops this mathematical formula that gets blamed for a global financial meltdown.
And doesn't disappear in disgrace, no. He goes back to China to take a prominent job, doing what? Assessing financial risk for the Chinese government?
It's quite a pattern. It does make you wonder if it's all just coincidence or if there's something more deliberate going on, like this source suggests.
The source definitely leans towards deliberate. It lays out this really provocative claim, suggesting the Li clan's activities historically include things like occult religious activity, criminal business organization, even assassinations, blackmail, and infiltration of government and finance.
Whoa, okay. That's a heavy accusation. Occult activity.
Yeah, and it directly links this alleged history to a hidden interest in developing such formally explicit models like Dr. Lee's formula, which ultimately crashed the system, supposedly hitting the Anglo-American financial elite particularly hard.
So the implication is, maybe it wasn't just an accident. Maybe it was targeted.
That's the strong suggestion. The source argues these kinds of behaviors, the alleged criminality, the infiltration, the occult ties, aren't new, but are millennia old and tied to this banking class. It implies it's something more than just greed or human weakness. It's presented as a consistent long-term strategy.
Okay, this is a lot. A clan with millennia of history, tied to the invention of paper money, allegedly involved in occult practices and infiltration, and then linked to the 2008 meltdown. It definitely pushes you to ask, like you said before, what other groups might be operating like this, behind the scenes.
Exactly. If this one clan has these alleged deep, hidden ties, who else is playing this game at the intersection of power, finance, and hidden knowledge?
Which brings us neatly to part 3. The Bilderberg Group, a post-war détente of elites. And maybe we should start this with a quote the source highlights. It's from James Warburg. His father, Paul Warburg, helped create the U.S. Federal Reserve, remember?
Right, the Warburg banking family.
So James Warburg is testifying to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1950, and he says, apparently quite bluntly, "We shall have world government whether or not you like it by conquest or consent."
Chillingly frank, isn't it? And it immediately makes you think of older warnings, like Thomas Jefferson worrying about a deliberate systematical plan of reducing us to slavery, or the Declaration of Independence talking about throwing off rulers when there's a long train of abuses, showing a design for absolute despotism.
Yeah, the source kind of frames these historical warnings not as ancient history, but as relevant context for understanding the long-term goals of certain elite groups today. A hidden pursuit of global control, maybe stretching back way further than we think.
Right. And before we get to Bilderberg itself, the author lays out this, well, it's a hypothetical scenario, but it's meant to set the stage. Imagine, they say, a really advanced ancient civilization, super high-tech.
Like Atlantis or something.
Maybe even older, the source implies. They call Egypt and Babylonia pale legacies of these guys. Anyway, this civilization tears itself apart in some massive great war, maybe even fought across planets, who knows? But as things collapse, the survivors from both sides supposedly get together secretly to save their science and tech. How? By encoding it into intricate symbolic language, think myths, sacred geometry, alchemy maybe, and setting up secret fraternities to pass this knowledge down through the ages, waiting for a time when it could be decoded and used again.
So like a time capsule of lost super science, hidden in symbols and secret societies.
That's the idea. A strategy for long-term survival and eventual recovery of whatever they lost. And the source links this hypothetical past to the timing of the first Bilderberg meeting in 1954.
How so?
Well, 1954 was apparently right around when serious public discussion of things like anti-gravity physics kind of vanished from open scientific literature. It just stopped being talked about openly.
Weird timing.
And even more controversially, this period is also when President Eisenhower supposedly had meetings. The source mentions theories involving either extraterrestrials or maybe terrestrial Nazis who had escaped to South America.
Okay, that's deep into conspiracy territory. But the source is linking Bilderberg's founding to this period of intense secrecy around advanced physics and maybe even non-human or hidden human groups.
Exactly. It suggests powerful financial interests, the kind behind Bilderberg, had a deep hidden focus on this kind of advanced physics, and maybe there was this subtle, ongoing struggle for control over that knowledge right from the start.
Okay, so against that backdrop, what does the source claim about Bilderberg's real origins? The official story is fostering cooperation between Europe and North America after the war.
That's the public version, yeah. The first meeting in 1954, Hotel de Bilderberg in the Netherlands. But the source alleges a much more secret agenda. It claims Lord Rothschild and Lawrence Rockefeller personally handpick 100 of the world's elite.
Handpick.
For the secret purpose of regionalizing Europe, think forerunner to the EU, and creating an international alliance to basically consolidate power. The source quotes David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski talking about the Trilateral Commission, which came later, aiming to control the 4 pillars of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical, under a central world government.
World government again. Oh, but here's the really shocking part the source brings up. The alleged Nazi connection.
Yeah, this is probably the most explosive claim about Bilderberg's founding. The source alleges it was set up, at least partly, as a liaison office for something called Martin Bormann's Nazi International.
Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. He supposedly died, but there have always been rumors. So, a Nazi International, like a network carrying on after the war.
That's the idea presented, a clandestine network. And the source names names. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a former SS officer, was the first Bilderberg chairman. And Dr. Hermann Joseph Abs, described as Bormann's banker and a director at the infamous IG Farben.
Farben, who made Zyklon B.
Right. Abs was allegedly at later Bilderberg meetings, so the source asks the obvious question. Why would these powerful Anglo-American elites, the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, get involved with remnants of the Nazi regime? It seems contradictory.
It does. So what's the explanation offered?
The source calls it a marriage of convenience, a modus vivendi, a working arrangement. It claims this alliance was set up for practical reasons, channeling huge amounts of stolen Nazi loot, money laundering on a massive scale, and global intelligence gathering.
Okay, so shared interests in dirty money and spying.
That's part of it. But the source claims Bormann's network held powerful coercive leverage over this new alliance. What leverage? Well, partly their existing intelligence networks, but critically.
Let me guess. Physics.
Bingo. Alternative physics. Advanced tech, the North American faction, the Rockefeller side, dearly wish to possess.
So a trade-off. Nazi tech and intel in exchange for
What?
protection. Place at the table. Laundering their money.
Pretty much. The source paints it as this complex, uneasy truce between powerful factions who actually distrusted each other but needed each other. It implies that beneath the surface of Cold War politics, there was this ongoing covert war between these elite groups.
And the source suggests this truce, this post-war detente between the factions, has been breaking down more recently.
Yeah, it hints that the cracks are showing, that the underlying conflict is becoming more visible, and the stakes aren't just money or politics, but control over this potentially world-changing knowledge, especially around energy, physics, and these underlying cycles that seem to govern everything.
Which is a perfect segue into part 4, the cycles of control and econophysics. And we start this, surprisingly, with President Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, Hoover. Not usually remembered for cutting-edge research, mostly blamed for the Great Depression.
Right. But the source highlights something most people don't know. After the crash, Hoover quietly got his Commerce Department, specifically an economist named Edward Dewey, to study why we have these boom and bust cycles in the first place.
And Dewey's work became his life's mission. He founded the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and what he found was, well, astonishing. He discovered these clear rhythms, these waves of behavior, not just in stock prices or commodity futures.
Led everywhere.
Pretty much everywhere he looked. Pig iron prices, sure, but also things like pumpkin harvests, yeast cell reproduction rates, how often fruit flies breed, even atmospheric ozone levels across economics, sociology, biology, even geophysics.
That's incredible. So it wasn't just random noise, there was a pattern.
A quantifiable, regular pattern. That was the huge takeaway from Dewey's work and the Foundation's database. These cycles weren't just discernible, they were regular, measurable, and therefore predictable, at least in theory. It suggested this underlying order beneath the chaos we usually see.
Okay, predictable cycles governing almost everything. How do we even wrap our heads around that?
Yeah.
The source uses an analogy, right?
Yeah, it borrows from the philosopher P.D. Ouspensky. It's a bit mind-bending. Imagine you're a creature living in only 2 dimensions, like flatland, on a tabletop. You can see left, right, forward, back, but you have no concept of up or down.
Okay, I'm flat.
Right. Now imagine a 3-dimensional wheel passes through your flat world, dipping through a slot in the table. What do you see?
Just a line appearing and disappearing.
Yeah.
Maybe changing color or width as different parts of the wheel go through?
Exactly. You'd see a sequence of events on your 2D plane. You might think one event causes the next in a simple line, but you'd be missing the bigger picture, the rotating 3D wheel causing the whole pattern.
Ah, I see. So the analogy is that we might be like those 2D beings focused on immediate cause and effect and completely missing these larger, maybe higher dimensional Y waves, as the source calls them, that are actually driving the cycles we observe in economics, history, maybe even biology.
That's the core idea. It proposes this concept of econobiophysics, that living things, maybe even whole societies or economies, act like transducers, like antennas or tuning forks vibrating in response to these deeper, longer waves. Coupled harmonic oscillators is the technical term used.
Wow. And if that's true, what does it mean for trying to control things? Like governments trying to manage the economy?
Well, the implication is pretty profound. The source argues that government policies, things like interest rate changes or stimulus packages, can only really exacerbate or alleviate the trend of a cycle that's already happening.
So you can ride the wave better or worse, but you can't stop it or reverse it.
Not fundamentally, no. Not unless, the source says, you have a revolutionary expansion of the system itself, or you introduce some radical new bottle-expanding technologies. Basically, unless you change the fundamental rules of the game or the scale of the system, you're just tinkering around the edges of these much bigger underlying rhythms.
Okay, that limits human agency quite a bit. So the big question then becomes, who knew about these cycles? And were they using this knowledge?
Now we're getting to the heart of it. The source reveals, maybe unsurprisingly, that a large corporation and bank was represented in the Foundation for the Study of Cycles membership. So, the big players were definitely aware, paying attention.
They had a seat at the table looking at Dewey's data.
Seems so. And furthermore, the source claims individual bankers used some sort of knowledge of such cycles to time their entrance into various markets or the expansion of their financial empires. They weren't just watching, they were potentially trading on this knowledge.
Okay, so how would that work? The source connects this to Ellen Hodgson Brown's work, right? The bankster strategy.
Yeah, the classic pattern she describes. Inflate the money supply, make credit easy, create a boom, everyone feels rich, goes into debt. Then deliberately contract the credit supply, pull a rug out, trigger a crash, a depression, and when everyone's desperate and assets are cheap,
they swoop in and buy everything up for pennies on the dollar.
That's the alleged mechanism. Create the boom, then create the bust, and profit from both ends, consolidating ownership. And here's where it gets even stranger. The source brings in an astrologer, Robert Gover.
Astrology?
Really?
Yeah, stick with me. Gover apparently charted the 3 biggest depressions in U.S. history up to that point, 1780s, 1870s, 1930s, and he found that each one coincided with a specific, rare planetary alignment called a grand cross.
So, the timing of these engineered boom-bust cycles allegedly lined up with major astrological configurations. The implication being
that these banksters, as the source calls them, weren't just masters of finance, but maybe they understood or believed they understood these deeper cosmic cycles, and they were timing their market manipulations to align with them, leveraging the rhythm of the universe itself for profit.
That is a mind-bending claim. If true, it suggests they have access to knowledge, or at least a belief system, that ties finance directly to cosmology. What kind of physics could possibly underpin that? A science way beyond what we normally learn about. Precisely. And that's our doorway into Part 5. Echoes of a Lost Science in Advanced Physics. Where does the source go with this?
It starts with some pretty cutting-edge, maybe even fringe, physics. It talks about a German physicist, Dr. Hartmut Müller, and his global scaling theory.
Global scaling?
Yeah.
What's the gist of that?
The idea is that there's a fundamental pattern, a standing pressure wave, but not in normal space, in the logarithmic space of scales and measurements. Think of it like the universe has a preferred set of sizes and frequencies, like musical notes on a scale.
Okay, like a cosmic harmony?
Kind of, yeah. Miller argues that all the discrete measurements we find in physics, the sizes of atoms, planets, galaxies, the frequencies of light, they all fit onto this single underlying harmonic series, a recurrent logarithmic pattern. It's basically proposing a unified structure for everything based on resonance.
A literal music of the spheres, almost. How does that connect to planets and finance cycles, though?
Well, think about resonance and harmony. The source then brings up research done in the 1950s for RCA, the radio company, by a guy named J.H. Nelson.
RCA, what were they looking at?
Radio signals. Nelson found that the quality of shortwave radio propagation wasn't random. It was strongly affected by the geometric relationships between the planets. Not just their gravity, but their angles to each other, their alignments, planetary geometry affecting radio waves. How?
Apparently, through their influence on the sun. The planetary alignments affect solar activity, sunspots, flares, and that, in turn, affects the Earth's ionosphere, which is what reflects radio waves. It highlights this idea of interconnectedness, of rotating systems within rotating systems, planets around the sun itself rotating, all influencing each other through subtle energetic fields.
Okay, so planets influence the sun influences Earth's radio signals. It's all connected. What else?
Then we get to Hannes Alfvén, a Swedish Nobel laureate in physics. He championed plasma cosmology.
Plasma, like the stuff inside stars and lightning.
Exactly. Superheated, electrically charged gas. Alfvén argued that cosmic phenomena, galaxies forming, nebulae glowing, are shaped primarily by huge electrical and magnetic forces acting on plasma, not just gravity. He basically scaled up laboratory plasma experiments, like particle accelerators, to the size of the cosmos.
Cosmic electrical engineering.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And a key idea in his work was scale invariance. He proposed that electromagnetic forces work the same way, whether you're looking at a tiny plasma in a lab or a giant galaxy. The physics scales up and down. But time, he argued, is scale sensitive. Things happen at different rates at different scales.
Okay, scale invariance for forces, scale sensitivity for time. What's the big implication of that?
It's huge. If the physics is scale invariant, Alfvén suggested, you can study those immense cosmic plasmas the way they confine energy, generate magnetic fields, and learn how to build much better fusion reactors right here on Earth.
Better fusion, like clean, limitless energy.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And it goes even further. It opens the door to tapping what's called zero-point energy, the energy inherent in the vacuum of space itself.
Energy from empty space. That sounds like alchemy again.
It really does. The idea that seemingly empty space is actually teeming with this background energy and that we could potentially draw on it. It's a foundational concept in this alternative physics the source explores. An infinite energy source.
Infinite energy. Which brings us back to the Nazis, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The source mentioned their search for an ultimate energy source. And this Nazi bell.
Right, Die Glock. The source connects these ideas about plasma and energy directly to that alleged secret Nazi project, possibly led by an Argentinian physicist working for them named Dr. Ronald Richter.
And how did the bell supposedly work?
The theory presented is that it involved spinning plasma at incredible speeds, precessional rotation, and then hitting it with powerful electrical pulses to create shockwaves. But the goal wasn't just fusion energy in the conventional sense. Fusion was seen as a kind of gateway.
A gateway to what?
To a much more profound and potentially deadly physics, something beyond just making power. The bell itself is described as having two heavy cylinders counter-rotating, filled with this weird mercury-like substance. The source calls it Zerum 525, possibly mercury doped with radioactive isotopes, maybe high-spin state nuclear isomers. Very exotic stuff.
Counter-rotating cylinders filled with radioactive mercury. What was it for?
The alleged purpose was mind-blowing. To manipulate or transduce the energy and fabric of space-time itself.
Manipulate space-time.
Seriously, that's the claim, and the source draws a parallel here to the work of a Russian astrophysicist, Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev.
Kozyrev, what did he find?
Kozyrev studied stars, which are basically giant rotating balls of plasma, right? He calculated that they produce far more energy than can be explained by nuclear fusion alone. His controversial conclusion was that stars must also be drawing energy from somewhere else.
Don't tell me higher dimensions.
That was his hypothesis, that stars act as transducers, pulling energy from a higher dimensional space. So the conceptual link the source makes is this. Rotating plasmas, whether in a star or maybe in the Nazi bell, are gateways or transducers for energy from another dimension or from the vacuum itself.
Okay, that's out there.
Yeah.
But it connects the Nazi tech back to plasma physics and this idea of tapping unconventional energy. Does it connect to anyone else?
Oh, yes. It sounds remarkably similar to the work of Nikola Tesla.
Tesla, of course. How so?
Well, remember, Alfvén talked about electromagnetic hydrodynamic waves in plasmas. The source points out that sounds a lot like Tesla's descriptions of electroacoustic or electrical longitudinal waves that he experimented with using high frequencies.
Longitudinal waves, like sound waves, but electrical.
That's the idea, different from the transverse waves of normal radio or light. Tesla believed he could use these waves and the Earth itself as a conductor to transmit power wirelessly around the globe. He literally talked about gripping the Earth.
Right, his Wardenclyffe Tower project.
Exactly. And he didn't just talk about power. He claimed his technology could be weaponized, that he could build wireless power plants capable of making entire regions uninhabitable. That's pretty scary potential.
And didn't the source mention the Tunguska event? The huge explosion in Siberia in 1908?
It floats the possibility, yeah. Could Tunguska have been an accidental discharge from one of Tesla's experiments? Or maybe a deliberate test? The source also mentions concerns that these kinds of pulsed scalar EM systems could trigger disastrous feedback from the sun, suggesting a potential for cosmic-level disruption.
So powerful tech, potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
The source claims it was suppressed.
Systematically suppressed, it argues. It mentions Tesla apparently offered Britain a system for $30 million before World War I, claiming it could make them impervious to attack. They turned him down.
Why suppress it?
Well, the source suggests a link to Germany after World War I. They were under the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, banned from developing conventional weapons. Maybe they saw Tesla's kind of physics as a technological end run, a way to leapfrog those restrictions with unconventional weapons and energy sources.
And the financiers. J.P. Morgan funded Tesla initially, didn't he?
He did. But the source highlights Morgan's later efforts to privately develop and later suppress its instrumentalities, meaning Tesla's tech. Morgan famously pulled funding from Wardenclyffe when he realized Tesla intended free wireless power for everyone, not something he could easily meter and control.
Oh, the profit motive.
And Tesla himself testified that Wardenclyffe wasn't just for telegraphy, but to telephone. Send the human voice and likeness around the globe through the instrumentality of the Earth. A global communication and power grid, free for all. You can see why certain interests might want to shut that down.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got these powerful elites, maybe understanding deep cosmic cycles, maybe accessing or suppressing advanced physics related to plasma, zero-point energy, maybe even manipulating space-time. Where did they get this knowledge? Did it all come from guys like Tesla, or does it go back further?
The source argues it goes back much, much further, which brings us to part 6. Ancient temples, sacred geometry, and the banking elite. And there's this core idea right at the start.
What's that?
The farther back in history one goes, the closer the relationship between science, magic, and money becomes. It suggests these things weren't separate domains in the distant past, but deeply intertwined.
Science, magic, and money. Okay, how does that play out?
Well, think about money creation. Historically, it was often a power of the state, right? Issuing coins. But the source points out that the value of gold, especially in places like ancient Rome, was hugely boosted by religious decrees, sacerdotal ordinances. The temples basically declared gold sacred, giving it a power beyond just its material properties.
So religion gave gold its mystique, its ultimate value, implying a link between the bankers, the bullion dealers, and the priests.
Exactly. The source suggests the bullion trust and the temple were, at the very least, allies. Or maybe even more deeply, the one has infiltrated and taken over the other. They essentially weaponized the sacredness of gold, turning an ancient myth into a tool for political and economic control.
Control built on belief, enforced by the temple. Where is the evidence for this ancient bullion trust?
The source delves into the grim reality of ancient gold mining, focusing on Egypt and the mines in Nubia, the land of gold.
Nubia, right. What was it like there?
Horrific. The source quotes the historian Adoris Siculus, who visited around 50 BC. He described vast numbers of slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, sometimes whole families forced into brutal, unending labor.
Sounds awful.
It was. Starvation, beatings, worked literally to death, and guarded by international mercenaries to prevent any escape. Men, women, children, all forced to dig and process the ore under the most appalling conditions imaginable.
Just grinding people into dust to get gold. What's the significance of that, beyond the brutality?
Well, first, it shows the immense human cost behind consolidating this sacred metal, the sheer power required. But the source also notes something interesting found in those mines alongside the gold. Quartz.
Quartz, like the crystal.
Yeah. A semi-precious stone, but one often associated with, energy conduction, piezoelectric properties, spiritual significance in many traditions. This source hints that the ancient bullion brokers might have been interested in more than just the gold itself. Maybe the extraction process, the location, the quartz. Maybe it related to manipulating earth energies, too.
Huh. Golden quartz from slave mines. Then the source talks about gemstones, too, right? Not just gold.
Right. It explores the ancient beliefs about gemstones having actual powers, healing, making you invisible, levitation. The source even mentions King Solomon supposedly having a gem that gave him power over creation.
Power over creation. Wow.
And these beliefs were often tied to astrologer, like an Assyrian priest's breastplate with 7 gems, one for each of the 7 classical planets. It suggests These elites weren't just hoarding wealth, but maybe seeking tools of power based on esoteric correspondences.
And there was a Sumerian epic mentioned.
Yeah, the Epic of Ninurta. It apparently contains this section that seems like just a boring list, an inventory taking of captured stones after some mythic war. But the descriptions of these stones allegedly hint at extraordinary properties, echoing that earlier idea of salvage technology from some ancient conflict.
Okay, so we have gold, gems, slaves, astrology, hints of ancient wars and tech. How does this tie into a coordinated conspiracy?
This is where the source introduces the work of David Assel and his idea of an ancient international bullion brokers trust. Assel apparently compiled a huge amount of evidence arguing for this ancient conspiracy.
A secret cabal of bankers running things from behind the scenes way back then.
That's the thesis. Allied with the temple priests, manipulating governments, religions, even the gods people worshipped, all to control the flow of money and resources. Assel, according to the source, argued this was the parent conspiracy to the ones people talk about today, the original blueprint.
The original conspiracy
Yeah.
spanning millennia. What evidence does he use?
The source mentions Assel using historical conflicts, like the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, as examples. He apparently framed it as the international money power attacking a state like Sparta that was trying to remain self-sufficient, trying to maintain its autarky, its independence from external debt and control.
So, ancient wars driven by financial manipulation.
That's the argument. And connecting it back to that hypothetical ancient civilization, if survivors wanted to rebuild their lost power, maybe even restart their interplanetary conflicts, they'd need global resources. They'd need to consolidate control over the whole planet. And what's the easiest and least technologically sophisticated way to do that? Money and religion. Use debt and belief to manipulate people, create conflicts that drive technological advancement in the direction they want, build bigger and bigger empires, all leading towards their ultimate goal.
Wow. So temples weren't just about worship, and banks weren't just about money. They were tools for a much larger, longer-term agenda, potentially involving lost science and cosmic ambitions. And this ancient alliance understood subtle energies. How did they use them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it takes us right into the final part, part 7. Temples as ancient technology and the human genome. This gets really deep into the idea that ancient sites were functional technology.
Functional technology. How we start with Earth grids.
Yeah, remember Ivan Sanderson, the biologist and paranormal researcher? He mapped locations of strange disappearances, like the Bermuda Triangle. He found 12 main spots, these vile vortices, around the globe with weird magnetic and energetic anomalies.
12. Like a pattern.
Exactly. And many of them, Sanderson noted, were near major megalithic sites. Easter Island, for example. It suggested these ancient builders knew something about the Earth's natural energy fields and maybe built on those spots deliberately.
And the Russians pick up on this too.
Independently, yeah. In the 70s, the Soviet Academy of Sciences published work suggesting the Earth's continents and features might align along the structure of a giant crystal lattice buried within the planet, an Earth grid.
A crystal Earth.
That was the idea. And later, American researchers Becker and Huygens expanded on this, showing how this proposed grid pattern aligned not just with the geological features like fault lines and volcanic ridges, but also with the locations of many major ancient civilizations, Giza, Stonehenge, others.
So ancient civilizations clustered along the energy lines of this planetary grid.
It looks that way, according to this research. And it's not just theory. Remember Buckminster Fuller. His experiments show that if you vibrate a sphere, standing waves will naturally form grid patterns on its surface, especially if you use longitudinal waves like sound or perhaps Tesla's scalar waves.
Okay, so physics supports the idea of grids forming from vibration. And who else was interested in this? Oh, right, the Nazis again.
Yep. The source claims Nazi Germany, specifically Himmler and his occult advisor Karl Maria Williget, were the first modern power to seriously investigate these Earth grid theories, looking for power points to draw energy from the Earth itself.
Drawing energy from the Earth, how does that connect to temples? This is where Dr. Mehl comes in.
Dr. Konstantin Mehl, the German engineer, his thesis is truly radical. He argues ancient temples weren't just tombs or places of worship. They were shortwave broadcasting stations.
Broadcasting stations. Powered by what?
By the ambient energy field, he claims. Drawing on Earth radiation, solar energy, what the ancients might have called solar god radiation, maybe even neutrino radiation from the planets. He analyzed the architecture, specifically the use of the golden ratio, phi, in famous temples.
Like the Parthenon, the Pantheon.
Exactly. Temples of Zeus, Apollo.
Mm.
Mail argues this specific geometry wasn't just for beauty, it turned the temples into technical facilities for scalar waves. They acted like precisely tuned cavities, or resonators.
Tuned cavities, like in a microwave oven or a radio transmitter.
Sort of, yeah. Designed for maximum efficiency, maximum range at minimum transmitting power. He thinks they were engineered to resonate with and perhaps transmit these subtle longitudinal or scalar waves.
That completely reframes ancient architecture. And didn't he also retranslate some old text?
Controversially, yes. He suggested Latin phrases, usually translated as sending messages by courier, should actually read, "they cabled" or "they broadcasted," implying ancient electronic communication. He even proposed the Romans used animal entrails, like from sacrifices, as biosensors to receive news broadcasted through this system.
Okay, wow. Animal entrail radios. But he backs this up with physics.
He connects it to fundamental physics. Mail apparently derived the golden ratio itself from the basic field equations that describe waves, showing a mathematical link between normal transverse waves, like light, and these longitudinal or scalar waves, like Tesla's. And crucially, he showed that the geometry of the antenna or resonator is key to converting between these wave types.
So sacred geometry is antenna engineering in this view.
That's the implication, and it leads to an even deeper idea, that matter itself isn't solid. It's a standing wave of interferometry of other waves. Matter is a pattern, an interference grid.
Matter is a wave pattern.
Which means, theoretically, it's mutable, transmutable. Change the underlying wave pattern, and you could change the matter. It's the philosopher's stone again, but described in terms of wave physics.
The ultimate alchemy. And what's the ultimate resonator for these waves, according to the source?
Human DNA.
DNA.
Our genes.
Yeah. The source proposes that the ancient Hermetic code, the sacred geometry we see in art, music, nature, even I Ching, it's a legacy of this lost science, and its essence is fundamentally musical but genetic.
Genetic music. So our DNA resonates with these cosmic frequencies.
That's the idea. DNA itself acts as a natural resonator and transducer of this underlying harmony, these subtle waves. It connects this to the quantum physicist David Bohm.
Bohm. What did he find?
Bohm studied plasmas, too. He noticed electrons didn't always act randomly. Sometimes they moved together in concert, almost like they were alive, creating exclusion zones. He theorized this coordinated behavior was guided by an unseen subquantum force matrix, a quantum potential, an implicit order beneath the explicit reality we see.
An underlying field guiding particles. Right. And Bohm's work implies that rotating systems, whether giant stars or the complex helical structure of DNA, are natural resonators, tuned into this deeper potential, this underlying field.
Okay, DNA as a cosmic antenna. This leads to the really disturbing part, doesn't it? If DNA is a resonator,
then the source claims some specific genotypes will be more efficient resonators than others. Certain DNA might be better tuned to these energies.
And this is where the source brings in ancient myths about gods and humans.
Yes. It points to recurring stories across cultures, Bible, Sumeria, India, Japan, Mesoamerica, about gods interbreeding with humans, creating hybrid offspring. And it notes that these divine or semi-divine figures are often described in the texts, controversially, as looking like white Caucasians. Now again, extreme caution here. We are reporting the source's interpretation of these myths and descriptions, not endorsing any kind of racial hierarchy or pseudoscience ourselves.
Understood. It's reporting the source's chain of argument, however problematic. How does this connect to modern times? The Human Genome Project.
The source alleges a hidden purpose behind the massive effort to map human DNA. Beyond the public medical goals, it claims a secret aim was to find and isolate those genotypes within humanity that point to a possible extraterrestrial connection.
Looking for alien genes, basically, tied to those ancient myths.
That's the shocking allegation, and it links this directly to the Rothschild banking family, citing myths about their descent from Nimrod, the biblical ruler who supposedly defied God. The implication is that this powerful banking dynasty believes they have this ancient, perhaps non-human lineage, and are using modern science to understand and maybe enhance it.
That is deeply conspiratorial and touches on some very ugly historical territory with eugenics.
Extremely ugly. The source explicitly connects the Human Genome Project funding and interest back to the Anglo-American international bankster class, and specifically highlights historical links between families like the Rockefellers and Bushes and the American eugenics movement.
Right. The movement aimed at improving the human race through selective breeding, often with racist and classist motivations.
Exactly. And the source raises the horrifying possibility of this genetic knowledge being used to create race-specific bioweapons or other modern-day weapons of genocide. Again, these are incredibly serious and disturbing claims from the source, presented here impartially.
Absolutely. It's vital we stress that. But the pattern the source draws is one of continuity.
Hmm.
The same old families, allegedly involved from ancient bullion trusts and temple manipulation through funding cycles research suppressing Tesla, maybe influencing Bilderberg, right up to the Human Genome Project.
The overarching claim is that they are consistently trying to learn and reconstruct as much of that ancient science and perhaps of their own family history as possible. It paints this picture of a continuous, multimillennial effort to gain and maintain control by understanding and manipulating the deepest forces of physics, finance, and now even biology itself.
So, after diving this deep, what does it all mean? We've journeyed through a narrative connecting alchemy, banking, secret societies, advanced physics, ancient temples, cosmic cycles, even genetics. The picture our source paints is, well, it's one of a hidden, consistent agenda stretching back thousands of years.
Driven, it claims, by a powerful elite, a banking class that understands, or believes it understands, the deep interconnectedness of everything, the cosmos, human behavior, energy, matter, and seeks to harness these forces for ultimate control.
And the source suggests this hidden world, this covert war between factions we talked about, might be becoming less covert now, that the old arrangements are breaking down.
That's the hint, yes, which leads to a final, pretty provocative thought. If this covert war is real, and it involves the kind of suppressed physics and ancient knowledge the source describes, what happens if that conflict spills out into the open? What does that mean for our future?
Especially if the stakes aren't just money or political power, but potentially, as this source suggests, the future direction, maybe even the genetic makeup of humanity itself. It's a heavy question. What will you do with this understanding?